Hello, welcome to this presentation about the module on narco terrorism and amino-terrorism. My name is Shovik Kumar Guha and I'm an assistant professor at the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata. So let us see what are the different learning outcomes of this particular module. The first learning outcome is to make the learners understand the fundamental concept of narco terrorism, what that means. The second is to make the learners understand the reasons why exactly terrorist activities are being increasingly sponsored by these kind of proceeds, monetary proceeds from drug trafficking. The third is to acquaint the learners with the existing Indian laws as well as international instruments that India is a signatory of, dealing with prohibition of illegal drug trafficking and money laundering with respect to these kind of narco-terrorism and amino-terrorism. And it is also to make the learners understand the process in which the drug trafficking proceeds are used in order to fund terrorists, the motivations for the same, and ways to curb such practice. Now, when it starts with the concept of what exactly terrorism means, what exactly narco-terrorism and amino-terrorism means. Now, when it comes to terrorism, we can say that when there occurs any activity involving threat or violence against either random or specified human or property targets, occasionally military but mostly civilian targets, with an objective to foster intimidation or generate pervasive fear so as to facilitate the fulfillment of political, religious, or ideological objectives, such activities are often referred to as terrorism. Now, the terms narco-terrorism and amino-terrorism have been coined to imply the existence of an unholy alliance and a dangerous nexus between terrorist activities and trafficking in illegal drugs and narcotic and psychotropic substances, including several amino acid derivatives. Trafficking in these illegal substances is an extremely lucrative business, and the proceeds from such activities are often used to generate funds for terrorist or subversive activities. The latter are often highly expensive matters, and it may turn out difficult to generate regular funds for those, even through other criminal activities such as, say, abduction, extortion, industrial espionage or sabotage, or even murder, and all of which involves flow of money through unconventional and often unstable channels. However, given the exceptionally huge sums of money involved in trafficking of narcotic substances all over the world, such trafficking has inevitably been adopted by the terrorists as a steady source of funds for themselves. If one looks into the linkage between trafficking in narcotics and terrorism, now there occasionally comes a juncture where they have compatible interests in terms of targeting the section of the populace that feels exploited and marginalized, and the resultant frustration leads such people to drift towards subversive and self-destructive practices. Now, the drugs and money involved in this process, let us see what they are about. On the one hand, narco-terrorism is certainly a category within the broader superset of terrorism, with individuals or groups taking part directly or indirectly in cultivating, manufacturing, transporting, or distributing prohibited drugs and disseminating the proceeds obtained therefrom. Yet another form of such terrorism may include aiding and abetting such activities or even providing security for people engaged therein. Some of the most popular drugs and prohibited substances that are the subject matter of such trafficking include the likes of cocaine, both in powder and crack form, chiefly made from coca plant leaves; heroin, derived from morphine, the prototype of most analgesics having a high addiction rate; marijuana, also called cannabis or ganja, made from dried flowers and leaves of the hemp plant, and probably the most commonly abused and easily procured drug, with some countries such as Netherlands having even made usage legal. Methamphetamine, and belonging to amphetamine groups that can produce mental instability including paranoia, delusion and violent behavior if used for long, with Myanmar and northeastern region of India being one of the manufacturing hotbeds. MDMA, also called ecstasy, essence or clarity, a synthetic drug that acts as a stimulator and mild hallucinogen. LSD or lysergic acid diethylamide, made from the fungus ergot and capable of evoking sudden changes and hallucinations, having an ever-growing market in the urban regions of Bhutan, Nepal, Myanmar and northeastern India, and PCP, an anesthetic abused in developing countries, in particular under varied nomenclature. Now, these drugs form one of the most highly sought-after consumer goods, and they are often sold for liquid cash that can also be moved around across borders and jurisdictions with relative ease and with little evidence left for subsequent legal prosecution. A case in point is that if one purchases 1 kilogram of heroin from the South Asian market, the current market price would cost him about 1 lakh rupees. When he sells it to, say, the United States market, he can easily get at least rupees 1 crore for it, which roughly translates into a profit margin of 9900%. Of course, this would vary depending upon the amount that he spends for evading or avoiding the respective laws in place in both the jurisdictions as well as during transit, but it still remains an almost stupendously lucrative amount. It is of little surprise, therefore, that the affinity for such trafficking has been rising among the fundraisers for terrorism and seditious activities at an exponential rate. Now, when it comes to the process of narco-terrorism, what it entails, heroin obtained from Pakistan and marijuana originated from Colombia are supposed to be the most sought-after drugs across both Europe and the United States at present. In order to fund their operations, terrorists therefore often establish connections within at least 3 separate groups, namely the illegal manufacturers of these drugs, the smugglers who can help in its transit, and criminal representatives of the so-called underworld who can assist in grassroots level distribution of these drugs. Some of the earliest documented instances of narco-terrorism include the organized effort of criminals engaged in the trafficking of these drugs, especially cocaine and cannabis, from Central American nations such as Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Nicaragua on the United States soil. The degree of success attained by them had even prompted them to establish a form of parallel government and conduct business on an unprecedented scale that used to support the entire economy of these nations. Subsequently, the widespread impact of this occurrence was felt in the 1980s, where the United States sought to restrict the spread of left-wing influence in the Latin American nations and faced stiff resistance. Now, given the economic contribution that trafficking in narcotic drugs was making to the domestic economies of these nations, it was well nigh impossible to bring those activities to an end, irrespective of introduction of stringent legislative prohibition, unless the economies were provided with feasible alternatives. The ill-gotten gains from narcotics trafficking on an international scale are usually subjected to money laundering to hide the origin of the money. What makes it difficult to unearth this trail is that several legal and even reputed financial organizations are often roped into the chain of laundering so as to keep the process out of suspicion. That, collectively with the whole process, mostly involving small-scale financial operators, keeps the flow of money pretty much under the radar. At the same time, what makes this nexus between drug dealers and terrorists and political miscreants appealing even to the former is the opportunity it allows them to get close to people who may subsequently gain political power themselves if their activities of terrorism bear the intended fruit. This is also one of the major reasons for the political scenario in the countries involved in narco-terrorism to be tainted with criminal elements with varying degrees. Both developed and developing countries are currently facing the menace of narco-terrorism, for the latter truly does not know any boundary. One of the most dangerous threats a government can have is for groups seeking to undermine its legitimacy, having inherent affinity to violence, no conscience, and access to almost unlimited funds courtesy drug trafficking. Having said that, if a state seeks to employ or strengthen a criminal organization sponsoring trafficking in narcotics, with the view of using the proceeds of the organized crime for subversive actions aimed against another state, it is more than likely to harm the interest of and society of the first state too in the long run, as those organizations, after having a taste of power, may subsequently turn on the hands that feed them. The growth of the mafia in different nations that had once been protected by both the US CIA and the Russian KGB, and the current volume of resources those two nations now spend in combating those organizations, be a testimony to such fact. Now, the question of why narco-terrorism is a social evil, if one tries to delineate the reasons why narcotics trade is of particular aversion to the society, some of the following reasons may come to mind. The link between terrorists and drug traffickers seeks to eat into the stability of the structure of the country those people operate in, fomenting corrupt practices over tendency to military options, weakened political regimes, lagging rate of development, and even regional rivalries between different parts of the country. It is a never-ending circle, since these features are born out of the linkage and strengthen the linkage in turn. Given the impact of drug trafficking on the domestic economy, all the organs of the state can even be infiltrated by the perpetrators, keeping in view the enormous profits involved. To give the proceeds a legitimate tint, industrialists and financial institutions are often made unwilling or ignorant participants in the process. In fact, every market dealing with financial trade, be it real estate, foreign exchange, stock market, media and entertainment, are targets for the subordinate operations of the practitioners of narco-terrorism. Money laundering and trans-border financial transfers form an integral component of this, so as to hide the origin of the proceeds of narco-terrorism used to sponsor terrorist activities and maintain plausible deniability at the same time. Especially in countries demonstrating an affinity to military rule, the drug money can even provide a parallel defense budget and hence act as an extra incentive for the government of the country to turn the other way when it comes to enforcement of anti-trafficking laws. The structure of narco-terrorism actually resembles an inverted pyramid form, involving greater number of people with every higher step, starting from individual cultivators of coca or poppy plants to the processors and refiners of the raw material, to the transporters and distributors of the refined drug, and those who provide protection to all these people on various levels. Now, the latter often include terrorists and occasionally even state organs. Conflicts of lower intensity as compared to full-fledged wars are often today sponsored almost entirely with the proceeds of drug trafficking in a well-planned tactical manner that is fashioned by states intending to eat into the stability of their neighbors without officially exposing their antagonism. If one can render even a sizable part of a nation's populace dependent on prohibited commodities such as narcotics, one would end up contributing considerably towards the volatility of the internal socio-political scenario of that nation, as has been exhibited by terrorist groups such as the Colombian FARC levying taxes on illegal drug traffickers, or the Hezbollah that emerges in trafficking itself, or even the state-supported Taliban who were funded primarily with narcotics money. When the terrorists get hold of such plentiful resources, they can in turn afford advanced weaponry, communication mechanisms, and sensitive intelligence, which in turn bodes ill for the target country, since financial superiority eventually changes the power equation. The case of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, who have financed their unrest mostly from heroin trade, can be cited as an example of this, as can be the cases of the terrorist and extremist groups operating in Jammu and Kashmir and the northeastern states of India and the Tamil LTTE rebels in Sri Lanka. Now, when it comes to international instruments prohibiting narco-terrorism, given the immense adverse impact of terrorism in the global arena and the strains that it puts national security of countries under, it is only logical to seek any knowledge that may turn out to be useful in combating terrorism. Discovering the source of its funds and seeking to curtail, if not eliminate, such source is one of the obvious ways to proceed. Now, such efforts were what had prompted the creation of the Convention Against Recruitment, Use, Finance and Training of Mercenaries by the United Nations General Assembly back in 1989. Under Article 5 of this convention, the member nations have been placed under an obligation not to recruit, use, finance or provide training to any mercenary. Needless to say, if a nation allows drug trade to flourish, having knowledge of the nexus between drug trafficking proceeds and terrorism, it stands accused of indirect infringement of this obligation via its contribution towards narco-terrorism. Apart from this convention, the United Nations General Assembly has also been instrumental in drawing global attention to the aforesaid nexus by adopting the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism, an instrument that has already been recognized by India. The biggest contribution of this convention in the struggle against narco-terrorism is its recognition of financing of terrorist activities as a standalone piece of criminal action, regardless of whether such activities bear fruit or not. This is evident from the prohibition of even passage of money through the territory of a member nation to such end, backed with criminal sanctions, as well as from its condemnation of the transboundary show banking or shadow banking that facilitates the proceeds of narcotics trafficking to reach the grasp of the terrorists. The relationship between illegal trafficking in drugs and other forms of organized criminal actions, of which terrorism is certainly one, has also been acknowledged in the United Nations Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances 1988, as has been the role this relationship plays in destabilizing sovereign nations. Furthermore, a 1992 report of the United Nations International Narcotics Control Board has emphasized on the continuing threat to political, social, and economic stability of countries that illegal drug trafficking represents, especially by way of its association with subversive activities in those countries. Now, insofar as the Indian scenario is concerned, India, given its geopolitical location, has always been the focal point of terrorist attention, often with the tacit support of the neighboring countries. The latter have often sought to exploit trafficking in narcotics and psychotropic substances having an amino acid base. With the profit obtained from such activities, they have provided funding for subversive activities aimed at destabilizing the Indian political scenario, a fact that has grave national security implications. Organizations such as the ISI of Pakistan have been known to be actively involved in such matters for more than the past 2 decades, along with compelling the poverty-struck minority population across different Indian states to participate in the same. Now, had this option not been there, it might have been difficult to continue procuring steady source of funds for such activities by these countries. This situation has been substantiated by eyewitness accounts of several terrorists apprehended in different parts of India, including Jammu and Kashmir. The global shortage of morphine for medicinal use, despite there being no dearth of opium production in countries like Afghanistan, as indicated by the International Narcotics Board report, also point out the growing use of such for narco terrorism, given the greater profits involved in the illegal usage of such products as compared to legal ones. National Crime Bureau records will also reveal that there has been a relative decline in states like Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir of conventional crimes such as robbery, dacoity, etc. that were used originally to fund terrorist activities, along with a corresponding rise in narcotics threat in those states. Military and counter-terrorism intelligence sources reveal that neighboring state-sponsored terrorist activities in Indian states such as Jammu and Kashmir alone costs about 20 to 30 crores of rupees in a single month. To procure such huge funds, therefore, narco-terrorism and amino-terrorism appear to be extremely lucrative opportunities, such as money obtained from trading heroin manufactured in the borders of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. While the fundamental economics underlying drug trade is fairly similar to other products, it is the illegality that is an additional factor and one that makes it difficult to dispose of the huge profits earned through regular channels. That is where the role of money laundering comes into picture. Given that almost no reputed financial institution would like to engage in transactions involving drug money, the traffickers use several unorganized yet efficient channels to move this money across borders. Once this money is funneled into investments involving legitimate businesses or similar practices hiding its origin, it is controlled by private financial organizations, especially in countries like Switzerland, Pakistan, Thailand, Afghanistan, and Hong Kong. Even legitimate businesses such as the Bank of Credit and Commerce International and the Habib Bank have been known to extensively use their resources for this purpose. Apart from these, drug syndicates also engage in various methods such as smurfing, double invoicing, investing in cross-border businesses and real estate, hawala transactions, smuggling currency, gambling, cash-kind conversion, routing the money through tax havens, and several other ways to launder the proceeds of drug trafficking and facilitating the money to reach the coffers of terrorist groups. While the Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle countries surrounding India have always been key producers of narcotics and amino drugs, India still remains the biggest legal producer of opium, a huge amount of which is diverted towards the illegal route. Surrounded by neighbors renowned for drug trafficking, India has always been susceptible towards illegal drug transit. Furthermore, India's current status as a financial center, as well as the numerous channels of trans-border monetary flow and the tax avoidance problems that it experiences, collectively contribute towards its vulnerability towards money laundering and terrorist financing by narcotics trade. the sheer volume of illegal narcotics that is confiscated in different parts of the country on a regular basis, despite being merely the tip of the iceberg, is sufficient to bear testimony to India being treated as a safe haven for narco terrorists, which is one of the most alarming threats faced by the country. The drugs that enter India via land from the Golden Crescent usually do so along the Indo-Pakistan border lying across Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, Gujarat and Rajasthan, or via small sailing boats across the sea along the long and less well-guarded Indian coastline at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and Lakshadweep. CIA intelligence sources from the United States have also confirmed that a large chunk of the proceeds of such drug trafficking is used by militant groups based in Pakistan to sponsor subversive activities in parts of India, including Jammu and Kashmir. Using disguised modes of laundering money, similar contributions have also been made under the guise of the Foreign Exchange Contribution Act. Narcotics Control Bureau, under the current control of the Home Ministry, has been the primary coordinator and enforcement body in this regard in India from 1986 onwards. The enabling legislation in this regard is the Narcotics, Drug and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985, the current version of which ties duration of sentencing with the amount of drugs seized and also controls legal deliveries of such substances both within and outside India. Apart from this, India has also entered into several bilateral agreements with several countries, including Myanmar and Pakistan, as well as extradition and mutual cooperation treaties with the United States of America. We have also signed international instruments such as the United Nations Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the United Nations Convention on Psychotropic Substances, the 1988 United Nations Convention against Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, and the Transnational Crime Convention. Both Interpol and SAARC also considers India as one of its members. To prevent money laundering and terrorist financing, India also has a plethora of legislations in place, such as the Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2002 and various norms and guidelines put in place by the Reserve Bank of India. To conclude, in the current era, it is increasingly difficult for states to directly sponsor terrorist groups or supply arms and resources to them in the light of the strengthened global scrutiny, which has necessitated such groups to lean towards alternate sources of funds, such as drug trafficking, which is what makes narco-terrorism and amino-terrorism a stark reality. Furthermore, these new forms of terrorism have the dual purpose of providing revenue as well as wreaking havoc on the societal stability of the target country. As the boundary between war and crime becomes increasingly blurred, this situation will further aggravate itself. Increasing international and regional cooperation and strong prosecutory regimes as well as political and social alliances are the only effective way of curbing this menace. The South Asian region, including India, may take lessons from the manner in which the United States DEA has sought to curb the Colombian narco-terrorism menace. While it is not possible for the entire problem of narco-terrorism to be eradicated at one go, perhaps phased targets can be set towards fighting it, with international bodies such as the UNDCP playing a more active supervisory role. That will be all. Thank you very much.